My father never liked October, and after he finally told me why, I began to hear the month the way he did, as if it had a sound you could pick up under the wind. He was an American soldier in France in 1944, 22 years old, and certain of nothing but the next step. He served with the 29th Infantry Division, blue and gray patch on the shoulder, mud up to the calves, on the far side of Saint-Lô, that pulverized cathedral of a town whose stone had turned to powder under summer bombardment, and now drifted in every ditch and doorway like a second weather. He carried an M1 carbine that felt light until it had to be lifted quickly, 3 extra magazines in a canvas pouch, and a pocket Bible that he did not read but would not throw away. He said the air in late October near Saint-Lô tasted like the inside of a steel bucket, damp, cold, and faintly metallic, a breath you couldn't quite warm. The line had moved east, the officers liked to say, but the land hadn't heard. It still wore the war on its skin. Burnt hedgerows, collapsed barns, scabbed roads where tanks had chewed and gone. On the night of October 30th, 1944, he told me, the fog came early and walked with them like a fifth man. They were a recon element pushed ahead of the regiment to feel for roadblocks and stragglers. 7 shadows with orders and a temperamental radio. Sergeant O'Hara with shoulders like a wardrobe. Lewis humping the SCR 300 on his back and working the handset with 2 chewed fingers. Mills, who was 19 and laughed too fast, Harper the medic who could tie a bandage with his eyes closed, and my father, Private James Calloway out of Wyandotte County, Kansas, who could listen better than he could talk. Their boots sucked at the bocage mud with that obscene kiss you never forget. They passed white road markers with faded numbers, a sign that once read, Saint-Lô 7, now blackened by smoke and rain, a warped placard in a ditch advertising pain d'épices for a shop that had been blasted flat in July. A draft horse lay by the hedge as if it had simply given up on standing, a harness rotting around its belly, the leather cut by some starving soul who'd walked off with the buckles. When the lane bent and dropped into a hollow, the fog thickened as if it had been poured there and left to rise. It smelled of wet leaves, diesel, old fire, and that other sweetness he never named, the way rot in a cellar always hides under the apple crates no matter how often you move them. They saw the village only because the roofs blocked a section of cloud from the pale evening, a subtraction rather than a sighting. No name on the plank that swung over the lane. Somebody had planed it clean, or the paint had been scrubbed off in rain like a confession taken back. Doors stood ajar the way mouths do when the body has forgotten itself. Shutters winked on slow hinges. Chickens were stiff in the gutter, heads bent under their own weight as if ashamed to be birds in a place like that. "We'll hole up, grab a stove and 4 walls, push at first light," O'Hara said, not because he believed in first light, but because sergeants are obliged to name things in a way that allows men to keep walking. The farmhouse on the edge looked whole from a distance. Up close it was a jaw with 2 teeth gone and the others cracked. The kitchen held a low, sulking fire that had eaten itself down to a dull red smile. On the table, a bottle of wine turned sour under a crumbed cork, a stone-hard crust, 2 plates powdered by the kind of gray you don't get from flour. A child's wooden cheval on the floor had lost 1 wheel. It lay on its side as if listening to the fact of its loss. Above the mantel hung a photograph in a blistered frame, a family of 4 in their best clothes, the mother's eyes carefully scratched with a pin. "No goddamn way," Mills whispered, and nobody asked him what he meant. War teaches you to agree by silence. They wanted coffee. They got the basement instead. The pantry hid a narrow door behind sacks of damp farine that clung together like bricks, and the stair complained under the weight of men whose boots had forgotten the noise of wood. The air below was the kind of cold that has a taste. My father said it was like opening your mouth in a dairy cooler after milking. Stale milk, old stone, onions that had lived too long in the dark, and sweetness as foreign as perfume on a farm girl. Flashlights slid along shelves lined with jars, amber liquid catching light like trapped hornets, and what floated inside were not carrots and not beets. Tiny vertebrae articulated like the ladders of a child's drawing. Finger bones arranged into spirals. Ribs fine as reeds. Birds' wishbones paired and tied with thread. Some jars held cloth bundles painted in black ink with shapes that tried to be letters and did not quite make the effort, honestly. Folk stuff, O'Hara said in the voice men use when they need their words to sound bigger than what they're seeing. Witchy, Mills said, trying on a laugh, deciding against it. The altar in the corner did not look built. It looked accreted. Stone thickened out of the wall like frost that discovered it could become useful. Wax had run down it in pale fingers. A small skull sat crowned with dried flowers. My father told me the part that made him shiver 50 years later was not the skull, not the crown, not the jars. It was the scrap of blue ribbon tied around the base of the altar, the sort of ribbon you keep from a child's birthday because you cannot bear to throw out all the day at once. Upstairs, the fire had given up the pretense of being heat. They fed it K-ration boxboard, and it blushed politely and stayed small. Lewis worked the handset. The SCR 300 offered a sheet of noise that sounded almost like language. The way a river sounds, almost like whispering if you're tired enough. "Wolfhound 2, this is Blue Jay," he said into the mouthpiece, a ghost with a need. "Blue Jay, Wolfhound 2. Say again." The static almost said back, and then it didn't, and then it did. And then it went under like a man in the wrong river. They ate cheese that tasted like bad rope and biscuits that turned to plaster in the mouth and chocolate that had gone white in the corners. "Halloween," Mills announced to the room with a grin that wanted a mirror. "You know it's Halloween?" No one answered. The fog pressed the windows until the glass looked bruised. At midnight, someone knocked. Not a rattle. Not the scared flutter of neighbors seeking shelter, and not the authority of men who want entry by right. 3 measured knocks, each one separated by the kind of pause that respects the existence of breath. "Qui est là?" Lewis said, and "Identify yourself." And the answer came in footsteps going away at a calm pace through fog that received and kept them. My father sat by the window until that transparent hour when night forgets itself and morning is still too proud to admit it exists, and he watched the porch beam and the black beyond for a figure that did not show and which he began to see anyway. At gray light, they found the footprints. Bare feet, many, splayed a little as if the people who'd made them had been walking since before their bones were hard. They came out of the field and went toward the barn, which stood at the edge like a patient animal. The door had been split and repaired with a board that didn't fit. It flexed with the breeze as if practicing a sigh. Inside, order, tools where they belonged, harness oiled, a scythe whose blade had been greased and wrapped against rust, a cart set square to the wall, and in the center, 8 chairs in a perfect circle. My father said when the beam of his light slid across the first face, he did not register it. The brain's first defense is refusal. A woman with hair braided neatly and hands folded. A man with a cap in his lap. A girl's eyes reflecting the slit of light like wet river stones. The mouths were sewn shut with black thread, stitches neat as a seamstress's pride. The skin had dried and pulled, but had not yet leaked its colors. The smell was not what you think, he told me. It was a sweetness that made the tongue want to lie. "Jesus, Mary," Harper breathed, and then the sound of the name turned to steam and hung there. "We bury," O'Hara said flatly. "We don't leave folks like this for carrion." Mills retched between 2 beams and apologized in a whisper to the barn. They dug behind the barn with e-tools. Short-handled things meant for the quick graves of war. The earth gave too easily. It was bread soft. When the spade cut down, something like air moved in the hole, a draft from below, and my father told himself it was the lay of the land and not the suggestion of breath. They did not look at faces again if they could help it. The old man had dried tear tracks on his cheeks that had cracked and flaked like snail paths, and once you see that, you must carry it. O'Hara lashed 2 fence slats together into a cross with comm wire and drove it into the damp soil with the heel of his hand until the skin split at the thumb web. "We're out," he said. "We're out now." They tried to follow the lane they'd come down, and it wasn't there. Grass had replaced it as if the ground had wished itself untraveled. The white kilometer post that had said 7 to St. Lo last night said nothing at all, the numerals drunk under a sheen of moss. The radio offered only a broad snow. Sometimes a thin thread of French ran under it like a seam you could see, but not pull. Rest, Toussaint, veille, stay, all saints. Eve. The compass on O'Hara's wrist spun with a lazy gaiety my father found obscene. The bell came at dusk, 3 slow tolls that did not belong to the ruin of a church they'd passed at the crossroads, because that belfry had been sheared and the bell had been carted off by men with ropes and kneed in August. The sound came from no distance and all distance at once. "Wind carries weird out here," O'Hara said, but he set it to the ground. A woman's voice moved through the fog, close enough to touch if you could have touched fog. "La Toussaint," she said, and the syllables sounded like stones dropped into water. My father did not yet know the calendar word. He knew only the way the hair on his arms rose like a field under a cold breath. They built the fire against the farmhouse wall and sat tight to it. The fog made a room. Nothing moved in it until something did. You can learn to hear the difference without admitting you've learned it. In the morning, Lewis was gone. His helmet leaned against the stoop. The handset lay in the mud with a half-moon of ice in its cupped earpiece where the night had proved itself. Bare footprints again, and these small ones overlying larger. All pointed toward the barn. The graves they'd made were open, but not as people open graves. The soil had slumped away as if it had declined to go on pretending. The chairs were still in their circle, empty now, and on the packed earth between them lay bones arranged in a geometry my father's hands understood and his mind refused. Clean white little lengths set like spokes around a hub. In the center, Lewis's dog tag caught a finger of sunlight and flashed with a cheerfulness that made O'Hara swear. They burned the barn. Fire speaks a language that feels like control when you have none. The smoke picked up that sweetness the way rain picks up dust from a road. It turned the back of the throat sticky. The rafters went with a despairing crack, and the roof sighed down, and the circle of bones stayed just long enough to be seen before ash took even that. "East," the sergeant said, "because men agree to a fiction for as long as it keeps them moving." They crossed 2 fields and a hedgerow dimpled by mortar rounds, and came back onto the same lane to the same farmhouse that had not waited for them so much as resumed them. The shutter hung now from the other hinge. The child's wooden horse had drifted by a foot across the floor, as if a careful hand had nudged it while dusting. Mills began to hum. He did it without knowing he was doing it, rocking his head a little as if he were waiting in line. "La Toussaint, il revient ce soir," he sang under his breath in a pretty accent he did not own. And when O'Hara gripped the back of his jacket, Mills smiled so wide his eyes went small. He stepped out of the grip the way boys step out of their mother's hands in grocery stores when they want to prove a point, and walked straight into the fog. They heard his humming for 30 seconds, then a fluting laugh you would not accept in a child, and then the barn creaked, though there was no barn. And then nothing at all. Harper said nothing. The medic's hands had begun to shake in small, precise circles, as if he were rolling a coin under the pads of his fingers. O'Hara tried to put his back to the farmhouse wall and keep the lane in front of him and the fields on his right and the hedgerow to his left, because geometry comforts men when God will not, and the fog said no and moved the corners until he was in the center of a room that had no center. My father felt the ground grow soft. It is possible for earth to feel like bread dough when it has taken too much yeast of a wrong kind, he said. It is possible for it to give when you step as if the field has decided it will accommodate you for the first inch and then think better of the arrangement. He tripped and his hand went into the soil up to the wrist and met another hand in the dark below. It did not grab. It did not claw. It held him as men grasp each other when one is about to speak and cannot. He came out of the grip with a yell he did not recognize as his. O'Hara shouted, "Hold!" In that tone sergeants have for the edge of a cliff and a swarm and the break. And then the shout had an end so clean, it left a ringing behind. My father found the sergeant's helmet where a dozen white stones had been placed around it. Neat as plates on a table you would be proud to show your priest. He barricaded the farmhouse door with a table that remembered having been a door once upon a time, long before it learned plateware. He fed the fire with chair spindles and thoughts he would rather have kept. He watched the window without blinking until the window blinked back. Hours passed on a clock that did not move. He told me the mantel clock had stopped with its minute hand at the Tournith, and he could not convince himself that the hand was not the cause of the stillness. Voices came, and they did not say his name. He would have preferred to hear his name. It would have meant the night had chosen to be personal. French came through the wall like water, not the words he learned later, but the shape of words told backward, the way you read a book in a dream and turn the pages and know it makes sense and wake with the sense stuck to your teeth, but not the meaning. He put his eye to a missing knot in the shutter and saw the yard full of people who were no longer people moving with the unhurried patience of those who have always had their time. Faces pale and damp and attentive. Bones laid with care. Circles inside circles like ripples when two stones are thrown together by boys who don't know better. A man in an American jacket walked by, holding something white in his hands, and this, he told me, was when fear found its manners and sat down. The living favor the living even when they are wrong. Some sleep took him the way sleep takes sailors, sudden and with no promise of mercy. He woke to a cloudy daylight that felt used. The fog had drawn itself up into the orchard and hung there like laundry that will not dry. The barn was ash. The graves were memory. The circle on the ground was gone. He knew it had been there because his hands told him so, though his eyes refused the information. In the yard lay the photograph from the mantel, frame gone, glass gone, paper not even lightly singed. The family on it returned to their proper number of eyes and smiling with their mouths and not with their sewn skin. He walked by the lane, then a ditch, then a road that gathered itself back together in the presence of a man who needed it, and found a town whose name stuck to a tongue like crust. The priest there had run out of candles in July and handed out rosaries made of knotted twine since. He gave my father a tin cup of cider and told him the war would move on and take its smell with it. The captain signed the report with eyes that had read too many reports and wrote MIA where he must. The 29th pushed east toward the next smear on the map, and the living did what they always do with the dead. They arranged them into an order the hands can bear. When my father told me this, he did not look at me. He looked across our small room at the window that reflected his own face back at him and assured him there was only the two of us. He said St. Lo, as if the name itself had been burned and could not shed ash. He said October 31st, like a man who signs a receipt for a delivery he has not ordered and cannot refuse. He said he smelled it still on some mornings. Old leaves turned sweet under frost, iron and something like sugar caught in the seam of wet wool. After he was done, I could hear the wind in the maple as if it had gotten inside the house. That night, around 2 a.m, lying on our couch because I could not bring myself to go to bed, I heard a bell ring 3 times. Our church on Main had cracked its bell in '77, and every hour it gave a clumsy clang like a spoon hitting a pan. This was not that. This came from no distance at all and from the wrong century. The sound went through the body the way a breath does when you've been crying and don't want anyone to know. He remembered more after that, the way men do when a door has been opened and the air changes. A church outside the village with a steeple that leaned as if listening. They went into it before the fog found them the second night, him and Harper, and the plaster had fallen in sheets and turned the nave into snow. The altar cloth was eaten by mice and reverent at the same time. A door at the back hid a room that had not been a sacristy for a long time, and had become a holding place for bones stacked with a housewife's knowledge of air and dryness, little skulls not tucked away to spare anyone, jawbones facing outward like brackets in a sentence you cannot close. He remembered the radio whispering in the code of static while the handset was on the floor. a woman's voice speaking as if to a child before bed, and a second voice answering in a man's laugh that knew the first voice and did not like it. He remembered the windmill turning when there was no wind and halting when there was. And he remembered a blue ribbon that appeared in 3 places any time he looked long enough. The altar, a fence post by the lane, the wrist of the woman in the veil who crossed in front of them with bare feet and no weight in the mud. He chose not to decide whether she had been alive. Choosing has its own cost, and he had already paid in other coin. He lived a long time after the war by most measures. He could fix a valve in a water heater in less time than it takes a kettle to boil, and he could sharpen a mower blade blind. He was courteous to people who did not earn it because he said courtesy kept the fog from circling. Every year on the 30th, I caught him at the window at some hour men are not supposed to be awake. The curtain moved by 2 knuckles, his profile like a woodcut. He would rake early before the frost could set sweetness into the leaves. He would not touch apples that had wintered in a cellar. He would not step into the corner of our yard where the ground dips as if a heavy wheel once pressed and the earth never forgave it. When he died, not in October, as if he would not give the month that victory, I found in his top drawer an envelope with 3 dog tags that did not belong to him. I put them in a shoebox with his patch and his laundry pen and the useless brass key he had kept for 30 years, because a key is a promise, even after the lock is gone. Now I carry the bell. Some late nights in my own house, I hear the 3 notes under the sounds a home makes when it breathes. Ductwork settling, a tired pipe groaning, the sigh that comes when a refrigerator gives up and waits for the relay. I smell it when a neighbor burns brush after a rain, and the smoke insists it has something to teach. I do not dig in the yard in October. I straighten the old photograph, ours, not theirs. And sometimes I think the woman's eyes in that picture are whole, and sometimes I think I remember a time they weren't, and either way, I leave the frame alone. When a knock comes, 3, patient as a courtesy grown in old soil, I stand in the hallway with my hand not on the knob, and I let manners save me. If I pass a field near St. Lo on a map, I do not touch the paper with my finger. I nod to the field the way a man nods to another man who has seen him out of a winter and does not intend to speak of it. If you ask me whether I believe in any of this, I will tell you that belief is the wrong verb for certain facts. The 29th moved east. That is true. The bocage stayed damp. That is true. On the night of October 30th, 1944, near a village that kept its name to itself, 7 men walked into the fog with their boots on, and fewer walked out. Every year the bells ring 3 where there are no bells, and the earth grows soft in a way you can feel through leather. You need not believe me. You need only be home before the fog comes up from the low ground, and the sweetness drifts over the hedges like a thought you shouldn't have. And if you must be out when it does, keep your shoes on, keep your voice down, and if you find a ribbon tied where no child should have tied it, walk away with your eyes forward and let the ground have whatever it has been promised.